Adinoi Mois Chaim Mimievcha Bekrav Shlomo Yevarach V'Rabbi Zachelim V'Sacheles Dabe Bas Miriam Alta Shlomo Ben Chave. The reason we say it now during this month of El before Rosh Hashanah is because it says as follows: LeDavid Hashem Eiri, God is my light. That is referring to, the rabbis say that my light is referring to Rosh Hashanah. V'yishi, my salvation, the rabbis tell us it's referring to Yom Kippur. Now, if you look at verse 5, it says, Ki yitzpeneni, he will hide me b'sukkah, in his sukkah. So that's referring to, obviously, sukkahs. So that's why we say this straight through the end of sukkahs. I'd like to delve just for a few minutes today on a very interesting verse. David HaMelech in verse 4 starts off as follows. Acha sha'alti. What's he saying? Acha sha'alti, just one question I have from God. Just one thing I want from God. Acha sha'alti meis Hashem, one thing I have from God, one question. Eisa vakesh. And what's that? Shivti beveis Hashem kol yemei chayai. Shivti beveis Hashem means please let me dwell in the house of Hashem kol yemei chayai, all the days of my life. Lachs, and that was his question. But all of a sudden he goes on further. Lachza is benayam Hashem, that I should see the sweetness of God, ulavakar be'choloi, and to dwell in his chambers, hide me in his sukkah, and he goes on and on and on and on.
One question.
He says, I have one question. This is the Jewish style, right?
Yeah.
I have one question, and he goes on and on and on and on. He gives God a whole shopping list. What's the rabbis say? What's going on over there? This is King David. You're requesting from God. So if you're only requesting one thing, don't say achas. Say, I'm requesting from God A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Why one question? They go on and on and on and on. So the rabbis, the people asked King David this question. You say one and you ask so many? David said, I learned from the best. Who did you learn from? I learned from God himself. You did this. God did the same thing. God did the same thing. Where did God do the same thing? A few weeks ago, we read in a portion of Yaacov as follows. Va'ata Yisrael, and now, O Jews, Ma Hashem Elokecha shel mimecha. What's God asking from you? What does God want from you? What's he request from you? Ki im li yiras Hashem Elokecha, to fear him. Fear and awe of God. Right? That sounds good. And all of a sudden, we start with a whole shopping list.
But why fear and awe and not love?
Hold on, we're going to it.
Okay.
Then he says, "Alechas b'chol derachav," to walk in his ways. Uliyava also, to love him. Right? V'lavid es Hashem l'kacha b'chol levavcha, and serve God with all your heart, v'chol nafshach, all your soul. Lishmar his mitzvahs, to keep his commandments, his laws, and he goes on and on and on. Wait a minute.
You learn from this.
King David says, I learned from the best. You did it, God, so I'm going back. I did the same thing. You have one request and you went on and on and on. I have one request and I go on and on and on. So what's going on here? And this is my point that I want to delve today on. It's really one request. It really is one request. And when you do one thing, our rabbis tell us, mitzvah, when you do a mitzvah, goreres mitzvah, it causes you to do another mitzvah. Aveira, if you do a sin, you do something wrong, goreres aveira. One sin leads to another sin. But if you do a mitzvah, you do something good, you feel good about yourself. You want to do something again good, something else good. So one thing leads to the other. He says, you know what? Back to Psalms. Acha sha'alti meis Hashem. Shifti beveis Hashem. Let me sit in the house of God. And then there'll be a domino effect. Then everything else will fall into place. Everything else. Then I'll learn to. Then God will save me and protect me, and I'll see always the sweetness of God, and so on and so forth. What does God say in the Chumash? What's God asking? Fear Him. Because if you fear God, everything turns into a domino effect. You come out to loving God and doing His commandments with all your heart and all your soul, and literally you're ready to kill yourself for God. You're ready to die for God. Why? Because the bottom line, it's a domino effect. Do this and everything else falls into place. We're going to open the ark and we're going to say, Avinu Malkeinu, my Father, my King. First thing is my Father. I don't want to ruin my relationship with my Father. My relationship with my Father is not only here in the synagogue. My relationship with my Father is when I walk the streets. My relationship with my Father is when I go out socially. I know multimillionaires went out on the biggest business meetings with the biggest CEOs, Goyim. And they say the only way we can go out to a dinner meeting is if we go to a kosher restaurant. And it's not just kosher, it's got to not kosher style, not kosher this. It's got to be a glatt kosher restaurant. And there were CEOs that wouldn't, they said, what do you mean? We only go to one restaurant. So they said it's not a deal. We're finished with the deal. Why? This is our Father in heaven. He makes the deal. I don't want to ruin that relationship with Him. And I want to conclude just with one thing. King David said, my request is to constantly sit in the house of God. Constantly. King David did not constantly sit in the house of God, my friends. King David fought wars. King David was running from Shaul HaMelech, from King Saul. He was running from his own son. He was always on the go. Right? Which, to be honest with you, I can tell you, this man over here doesn't even understand how you could be running from your own son, right? He says it all the time. We speak about it all the time. Because it's mind-boggling. And it's King David. It's not Yankee Orimland. It's King David. So what does he mean? I want to sit in your house all the time. He didn't. But he did. Says the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory. Wherever you are, you have to make it the house of God. Go to work, make it the house of God. Sit down in your house and eat dinner, make it the house of God. Walk the streets, you're walking the house of God.
Lincoln Financial Stadium.
Always the house of God. Go to a ball game, right? How can I go to a ball game? Make that the house of God. Very simple. Person goes with his tzitzis and his yarmulke, that's the house of God. That's always the house of God. I'm walking the streets, I'm walking the boardwalk, I'm walking the beach just with my yarmulke on. I'm not saying go swimming with it. How can I, when I go have a cowboy steak, Eric, the cowboy steak?
Yeah.
Have a cowboy steak in a glatt kosher restaurant. I make a bracha. I say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu shehakol b'dvarei on that steak. I just uplifted the steak to holiness, and this became a house of God. So wherever I am, says the Lubavitcher Rebbe, I can make that the house of God. I can make it a house of God, or God forbid, I can make it a house of something else. We don't want to ruin our relationship with our Father in heaven, and that has to be our goal now and our focus in Elul coming to Rosh Hashanah. This has to be a year coming up that we make changes in our life. I've been speaking about this for 2.5 weeks, and people come to me and say, I had someone Shabbos come to me and say, we're not going to change. It's hard for change. See, but meanwhile, I have to do what I have to do. I have to say what I have to say. I'm not scared of saying it. And if anyone's going to change, if I'm the only one that's going to change, I have to talk to myself also to change. We all have to change. Because to change, to become better and closer to God, there is no limit. So I reached this level this year, I got to reach a bigger level the coming year. But in order to be able to change, when that Sunday night comes, right, of Rosh Hashanah, and the Chazan's going to start, right, Baruch Hu. I have to start making the change now. Because if I don't make it now, it's not going to happen then. We have to psych ourselves up now. One thing, one request we have to have, and that request is, wherever we are, I don't want to ruin my relationship with you. I want to make wherever I am the house of God. And by the way, that's why every single house should have a kosher mezuzahs on them. Not only on the front door, but on every single entrance and every single door that needs a mezuzah. Not every door needs a mezuzah. Okay? And if we have questions, you have to speak to your local rabbi. Okay? Because that's a house of God. And that's why the Lubavitcher Rebbe also said that every house should have in a Jewish books a chumash, things like that, a siddur. Why? Because it's a house of God. What, are we only going to have in the house of God the magazines? You know, National Geographic, whatever it's called. Only those magazines, Sports Illustrated. It's a house of God. We have to have Jewish books. Okay? And we're not talking about Jewish books as stories by Martin Buber. We're not talking about that kind of Jewish books. We're talking about what it's all about, God's books that speaks about godliness and God. Okay? Why? Because at home, it's a house of God. I'll go even further. I say this all the time, but it's so true. If that's the case, if God's presence is all over, when a couple has, this is a question I was asked recently, when a couple has marital relations, how can you do it in front of God? Right? In English, I think they call it sex. Marital relations. It's brought down in mysticism and Kabbalah. Marital relations, when done proper, is the highest unity of God's name. You're uniting God's name to the highest degree that could be. Because what you're taking is two of God's creations, and they're together.
Having it together.
You have a halacha on that.
Huh? And God's inside of us. We have to let Him in. Okay? We have to let God inside into our lives. And all of a sudden God will be in our lives and in our businesses, and we'll see health and happiness. And we're all going to have a happy and a healthy, sweet year. Shkoyach.